there is no place to start other than the New York Knicks' thrilling win over the 76ers last night. This series was incredible all the way through. The ultimate point differential between these two teams was Knicks by 1. Every single game was a barn burner going down to the wire, and it was easily the best playoff series we have seen this year so far. Felt like this was really the series that was, and I know maybe I'm a little bit late to the party on this, but I don't think up until this series we really saw the birth of Jalen Brunson as a legitimate New York Knicks legend. Now, he has easily won over the heart of New York for some time now, put together a couple great regular seasons. He was great in the first round last year, and even in the second round when they lost to Miami, I wouldn't say that was necessarily on him. Julius Randle was, of course, dealing with the injury, and he was kind of harming the team out there, but the Knicks were a little bit prior to even necessarily having that level of contention anyways, and now after the season that he pulled off, gonna be either first or second all NBA, and this series averaging 35.5 points and 9 assists. It feels like he is going to be a lasting figure in New York Knicks basketball history, and I know that I'm a little bit younger and maybe I didn't get to watch, a prime Bernard King or Patrick Ewing or any of those Knicks legends, but when you look at this franchise, they've sort of been without, the bar isn't extremely high to be on that upper echelon of legends within the franchise, and Jalen Brunson is rapidly approaching that. Now, maybe I'm being a little bit prisoner of the moment, but I really don't think that is the case. The level of love that New York has for the Knicks as things currently stand are sort of at a historical point. Again, considering sort of the history and especially the turmoil in recent history of that Knicks franchise. But he scored 39 plus points in each of the last 4 games. The last time an NBA player has scored 37 plus in 4 consecutive playoff games was actually Michael Jordan, of course. So anytime you're in that type of company, I forget what the exact stat was they threw at Brunson on the TNT crew when he did the post-game interview, but there was a stat that they gave out there. He was in company with Oscar Robertson 50 years ago. So Brunson is doing something at such an incredibly high level that you do just have to appreciate. And especially, he was the best player in this series, I thought. You can sort of argue, I guess, Joel Embiid, but I think that Brunson was clearly the best player in this one. And time again, when the games got close, which they frequently did, it was Brunson making the plays. And even on a moment like last night where Josh Hart gets this open 3 from the top of the key, it's because of the fact that the 76ers were giving so much attention to a driving Jalen Brunson that it opened up a shot for others. And we saw earlier in the series they were trying to leave Josh Hart open because they didn't think that was going to hurt. They were trying to accommodate extra for the fact that Jalen Brunson was using the pick and rolls. Joel Embiid still not fully recovered. I mean, obviously, the injury debates around Joel Embiid are going to be you're going to have people who are just going to be on different sides because, yes, he played. He scored 50 points in a game. He looked really good. He definitely wasn't 100%, but he was healthy enough to drop 50, so there are going to be some people making excuses, some people saying he was out there one way or another. But regardless, that's a stupid tangent that I'm getting on here. The point is, Embiid wasn't necessarily at a level of health and a level of mobility enough to the point where the 76ers wanted to have him getting switched into these pick and rolls quite as much, so they were helping off him from the wings and leaving Josh Hart open as a result. And again, just all of this to be said, that the 76ers were specifically game planning to stop Jalen Brunson, and the first 2 games it obviously worked, but there was only holding Jalen Brunson down for so long, and he ends up torching them. And late in this game as well, even prior to that Josh Hart 3, we saw in the last few minutes of the game, the 76ers were sending 2 at Jalen Brunson every time he got the ball. It seemed like they were making a statement. We are going to make somebody else hurt us. And the one time they didn't send the double team, he was matched up one-on-one. I believe it was against Kelly Oubre. He blew by him, did the classic Jalen Brunson, which granted is not my favorite move, but it's fully in the rule books, and I obviously understand it. I don't think that it's unfair by any means. But what he does is he uses the speed, gets the defender on his back hip, and then sort of pulls up knowing that the defender is going to run through him from the backside. He ends up hitting the and one, misses the free throw. But again, one way or another, Jalen Brunson was just the full initiator for the Knicks late in this game. And I'm going to sort of avoid trying to get into the semantics of ranking the top 10 players in the NBA because I don't really like that activity as it is. It's very subjective. But when you look at Jalen Brunson and where he stands in the NBA, I feel like it becomes a very interesting conversation as to, is he showing that he can be a number one on a championship team? Because I know that all Knicks fans are going to be saying yes. It did feel like there was a lot of hesitation from NBA fans in general for a very long time in terms of, okay, we know that he's great. There's no denying that. But when it gets to a playoff series, when a team is fully doubling down on you in particular, are you going to be able to step up? And at least from what this first series would tell us, and again, I think that his playoff performances, the past handful of times he's been there, of course, being able to help lead the Mavericks to that 2-0 record against the Utah Jazz all those years ago when Luka Doncic missed the first two games with the calf strain, and then leading the Knicks to the first round win last year, first round win again this year. I feel like he has shown that he is a playoff performer, and when the Knicks first signed him, we knew, again, because we saw a little bit of the flashes when he was in Dallas, that this was a possibility that he could be a star, but superstar seemed like it was a little bit out of reach, and that is what he has reached at this point, and it is really encouraging to see. And in terms of this season at least, I don't think with the sort of lack of offensive support, I think it would be incredibly difficult for Brunson to continue to carry the offensive load like he currently is through 4 rounds of the playoffs. Now, every time we set limitations on Jalen Brunson, it seems like he breaks through them, so I'm definitely not counting him out fully, but I do feel like the Knicks are so heavily relying on, their top 7 guys. They're playing, the Dante DiVincenzo's and Josh Harts of the world. They're playing them 40-plus minutes. DiVincenzo, 48 last night. Anunoby, 45. Josh Hart, 46 minutes. And this is obviously a Tom Thibodeau coach team, which he always sort of results to sort of putting those heavy minutes on his starters. But this is at another level of desperation because of the fact that Randall's out, Bogdanović is out. But anyways, all of this to be said, I do think that there is, Jalen Brunson can be the best player on a finals team. Now, I think it has to be a better team than the Knicks currently have, considering all of their health issues and such. But I just think that when you average this type of scoring output, again, it is a first-round matchup. I feel like it's important to at least sort of provide some context. We did just see Jimmy Butler last year average 37 points per game, 38 points per game actually, in the first round matchup. He helped lead his team to the finals, but by the end of it, he was absolutely worn down. And they were reliant on some of these other role players stepping up, which isn't unfair by any means. You're going to need role players to help win playoff series. That's no secret, obviously. But at least for Brunson this season, I don't know if he necessarily has the support around him to fully pull that off. But it was just so fun to watch the way that he was able to take over this entire series. And I'm obviously a Celtics fan, meaning I'm not the number one Knicks fan, but the energy of those fans and the crowd and Brunson, the way he's taken over everything, is really electric, and it is super fun to see. It does sort of slightly, I feel like I've said it before on the podcast, but it does slightly remind me a little bit, probably definitely to higher heights, but the Isaiah Thomas years in Boston in 2000, it was 16-17 when he was averaging 30 points per game, and he was the king of the fourth quarter, leading the Celtics to the Eastern Conference Finals. It does sort of remind me a little bit of that. And now on the Philly side of this, as we have a comment from Thomas Gage saying it's fun to watch Embiid be a sore loser. Philly is in a very interesting position here, and we're going to sort of dive into Embiid specifically as we move on here. I don't know if the 76ers should have expected anything else, really. The season was, I wouldn't say lost necessarily, but as soon as Joel Embiid went down with his torn meniscus, this was sort of along the lines of best case scenario that they could make the playoffs and be competitive, but they were obviously at an inherent disadvantage because of the fact that they lost as many games as they did while Embiid was out. They ended up getting the 7th seed, meaning they were going to play a better team. And, there was a little bit of cause for hope because of the fact that down the stretch of the year, they won 9 straight games, including the play-in win. But they played a better team. And obviously, the close games in this series gave them hope, and I feel like there are going to be some 76ers fans that felt like they should have won that series. I honestly feel like that was the Knicks series to lose, and I thought that they had the best player in the series. I thought that Brunson outperformed Joel Embiid, and I will say this, I do think that there is some level of hope for Philadelphia because of the development of Tyrese Maxey. He looks like he's going to be the best teammate that Embiid has ever had in Philadelphia. Now, not going to forget about how good Ben Simmons, I know obviously everything that's happened since then has torn down his legacy, but prime Ben Simmons, if you were there, he was a monster on the defensive end in transition. It just all sort of fell apart for him. Really, though, that's his competition, and it's James Harden for whatever version that he was last year. And Maxey, I still don't think that he is necessarily ready to be that full number one option. We saw during the course of the year the fact that they were just 10-14 in Maxey games without Embiid post meniscus. Now, he showed flashes of being able to be you want to call him a Robin necessarily to Embiid's Batman. Game 2 and Game 5 were both incredible from him. Game 1 was pretty good as well. But it just doesn't seem like he necessarily is fully developed to the point where he can be the go-to guy game in, game out. And I love Maxey a lot. First-time All-Star, most improved player this past year, even though, again, I've already given my thoughts on that most improved player award. Feel like it was kind of a sham because Maxey was already the guy last year. But again, don't need to sort of dive into all of that once again. But Maxey provides real hope, I feel like, for Philly fans. I know that there's a little bit of a growing divide in terms of whether or not they want Embiid full-term, long-term that is, and whether or not you can build a championship team around him. Maxey, at least, is a teammate where headed into this season, there were a lot of rumors about the possibility of Embiid potentially wanting out. I don't think he's going to ask out anymore, given that he has Tyrese Maxey by his side, and now they are finally off of this Tobias Harris contract, finally, after all these years. It was a very fitting end for Harris, who had 0 points, took just 2 shots in 29 minutes. They mentioned that he took 1 shot, I think it was, heading into the fourth quarter at one point, and I had this moment where it was, oh my god, I forgot he even exists. He was a total ghost, and it's unfortunate because I liked Tobias Harris a lot when he was sort of coming up, was being passed around a little bit, but still found a way to come into his own. But he was a 20-point-per-game scorer prior to Philly, and that version of him just entirely disappeared, and by the end, he was just a non-factor, making tons of money for this team, over $30 million. He signed that 5-year, $180 million contract in 2019. And now that that is finally over, the 76ers have a new max contract spot. So we're going to be talking about their offseason later in the show. But rumors about potentially upgrading at that wing spot and putting together a little bit more of a big three, because I do think that when you look at this series, there is a little bit of a reality, and you have to keep the injury of Embiid in mind, but I think that Embiid needs legitimate other options next to him, multiple, because of the fact that we've just seen him wear down so much, and that was a repeated theme during this series where it came to the fourth quarter and Nick Nurse was playing him very heavy minutes out of necessity, because as much as I sort of liked Paul Reed in the past, it was pretty rough going for him in this series, and they didn't have a legitimate backup big option. And you have to credit Embiid for fighting through the knee injury, the Bell's palsy, all of it. But it just seemed like he was burnt out in a lot of these late game situations, and conditioning has been a conversation surrounding him throughout the first decade of his NBA career. And this year, like I mentioned, is obviously different because of the injury, but it still is a conversation. And it was frustrating because last night at times, he was having so much success taking Isaiah Hartenstein one-on-one in the post, and in the first half the Knicks were doubling a lot. In the second half they weren't as much, part of because that Buddy Hield just coming from the grave, hadn't played in each of the last 2 games. He exploded in this one, ended up scoring 20 points on 6 of 9 from 3. So the Knicks were giving Embiid these opportunities, and he just wasn't even really looking to attack in that fourth quarter. And it was disappointing to say the least. And I sort of alluded to this after game 5. Tyrese Maxey did sort of save Embiid a lot of offseason scrutiny because of that fourth quarter game 5 performance. Because if it weren't for Maxey going superhero mode and ending up pushing it to overtime, giving Embiid, and Embiid was solid in overtime, but through the first 4 quarters, I thought Embiid was bad, like legitimately bad. Scored 19 points, some of those coming in overtime as well, but 9 turnovers. They actually did a stat correction. At one point, it was at 10, so they sort of took away from that a little bit. Not saying that was right or wrong, but he was extremely sloppy in that game, and if that was his performance in their elimination game, I feel like he would have been set up for a lot more scrutiny this offseason. Now he sort of gets a pass because he plays well in the overtime, which you have to give him credit for. You have to give him credit for the 39-point performance in Game 6, which they eventually lose. But it's an interesting sort of subplot that everybo's going to forget about, but I'm going to choose not to, and not in a hater sense by any means, but it's the reality of Joel Embiid and these postseason shortcomings. Now, I'll say this was probably the first season, at least in a long time, that we haven't seen a drastic fall off from Embiid from the regular season to the postseason. In this series, he averaged 33 points per game, 10.8 rebounds per game, 5.7 assists per game on 44-33 shooting splits. So he was still good in this series, and by no means do I mean to drag his name through the mud. It's a very interesting conversation when you talk about Philly, and again, we're going to get more into their offseason later in the show, so I will save some more on that. It's never easy to stomach a playoff loss. I do feel like there are things that Philly fans can sort of come away with this, with some positives. Again, this was a pretty much lost season. Things were so grim when Embiid went down with that meniscus that ultimately this sort of ends up being a fine exit for them, although I'm sure Philly fans, again, don't want to hear that. They were hoping for more. But we're going to be touching more on the 76ers offseason in a couple segments. Stick with us to the end of the show, and we're going to be giving some previews on the Knicks' second-round matchup against the Indiana Pacers, who closed out the Milwaukee Bucks last night as well. So we are going to be now taking our first break, and when we come back on the other side, we are going to be diving into that Pacers-Bucks Game 6 matchup. So stick with us, and we will be right back.